Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. Today's video is part 15 of my review of the book Black on Red by Robert Robinson. He's 44 years inside of the Soviet Union. And before we begin, just a friendly reminder, if you're new to my channel, I have a separate playlist on this book. I'll post the link below in the comment section. In the previous episode, we learned about Robert Robertson's experiences with death of Stalin back in March of 1953. He lived in Moscow at that time, so he experienced firsthand all the events at his factory, as well as a stampede on the Red Square. So first of all, let's see what Robert Robertson felt about local people mood after the death of Stalin. That spring, it seemed to Muscovites that they might gain a bit more freedom. One could see the sparkle reappear in people's eyes. 3 months after Stalin's death, as I headed to a home of rest for vacation, I also sensed better days ahead. This is quite interesting because it goes completely in the opposite direction, the statement, than you can read. There was the biggest tragedy in the history of the Soviet Union, the death of Stalin, and the country went the wrong direction. But here, Robert Robinson talking about sparkle reappear in people's eyes. And it gets even more interesting after that. A few mornings later, so that's when he went to his place of rest, so-called sanatoriy, we heard over Radio Moscow that the Central Committee of the Communist Party had passed a resolution the night before declaring that all peasants, which means collective farm workers, are free to sell their personally grown agricultural products on the free market. The announcement said that the resolution had been signed by Malinkov. The Russian peasants were ecstatic. That night, as we were finishing dinner, we heard people singing in the distance. We went outside and saw more than 200 peasants holding torches, dressed in pre-revolutionary clothing and heading our way. When they reached our building, several accordionists started playing music and peasants of all ages began dancing. Soon an elderly woman mounted the stairs, asked for quiet, and sang a song praising Malinkov as the savior of Russia. Okay, so these events were not happening in Moscow, but in town of Klin, which is located about 80 miles northwest of Moscow. So he was out on the countryside. Then Comrade Robertson continues. It was obvious how much the peasants disliked collectivized farming. Years later, a number of party members told me that 19 million peasants had been banished from their lands as part of the Stalin's effort to enforce collectivized farming. So that's back in 1930s, early 1930s. Those who stayed on the land but refused to surrender all their animals to government ownership were subject to an additional tax in kind besides the regular tax in kind. I forgot to look up what tax in kind means. Which meant, for example, that for every hen they kept, they owned the government 80 eggs a year. Nice. Keeping one pig meant giving up 88 pounds of meat a year. So it's not selling, it's just given to the government for the right to own the pig. Should a peasant fail to meet this quota through his own livestock, he would have to buy the products from a government agency and then give everything back to the government. Fantastic system. This system would have been hard enough on the peasants if it had functioned properly, but it was controlled and corrupted by village Communist Party bosses who often became rich through black marketeering. Malinkov's latest decree allowed the peasants a bit of free market enterprise and reduced the tax in kind and the corrupt system it had bred. So what Robert Robertson is talking about here is so-called единоличник. So that's a peasant that has his own farm. So pretty much you could say he is a farmer. So he refused to join a collective farm. So he's not kolkhoznik, he is единоличник. But he was poor enough not to be called kulak, so rich peasant, or podkulachnik, somewhat rich peasant. So those guys, if they refuse to join kolkhoz and donate all their animals to the collective farm, they will be hammered with taxes which were double more than taxes that were laid on the kolkhozniki. So even if you work for collective farm for free, because there is a requirement to spend so many days a year, like 200 work days at a collective farm, it's a requirement, they had to pay taxes. Единоличники, so those single farmers, had to pay twice the tax. They had to pay tax for every tree or bush. Like if you have a strawberry, raspberry bushes or blackcurrant bushes, there's a tax on that, tax on the animals, and then tax on any income that you get from selling your crops. So pretty much everything was done to force those единоличники, those farmers, to quit and join a collective farm. And that's the topic. I didn't really get into it yet, but I mentioned it here and there. There was a huge difference between the lifestyle of city people in the Soviet Union versus village people. And I mean, it's big here in America, but not as big as it used to be back in the Soviet Union. And it was totally normal. Like for me as a kid, when I was heading out of the country, the northern Ukraine, to spend my summer with my grandparents, it was totally okay that after I leave Kiev, it was literally like going back maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, because, I live in a big city. We had running water, natural gas, all the conveniences, hot shower, public transportation, dentists, hospitals nearby, everything close by, schools nearby. Then I go to the village and hardly anyone has cars. I mean, mostly some guys had those motorcycles with the sidecars, Urals. People ride bicycles. They use horses that they have to borrow from the collective farm to plow their fields. They use outhouses that has no running water. There's only convenience electricity. So it's like you literally return back 50 years, even more. And it was totally normal for me because, that's how people used to live in the countryside. Like my grandparents had no TV at all, even in the early 80s, no refrigerator. They used a cellar. So basically, their lifestyle got stuck in early 1900s because they were just so poor, because they were taxed so much, and they had to work for free at the local collective farm. But only after a visit Amish people down in Indiana, because back when I worked at the farm here in Michigan, we delivered fruits down to Amish country every Monday night. I realized that Soviet peasants were more poor than Amish. Like Amish refused to use electricity because of their religious beliefs. But one time when we had a dinner with them in their house, and I asked them where's their outhouses located, because I needed to use the bathroom. In my understanding, if you don't have modern conveniences like electricity and stuff like that, you probably use outhouse just like our village people. And they actually got kind of offended. They said, well, our bathroom is down this hallway on the left. And I went, and it was a real bathroom with the sink, with the toilet. I used the bathroom, I flushed the toilet, and I was like, oh my God. Even Amish people in America have indoor plumbing and toilet. And my grandparents and everyone else in that village used outhouses. So that was the first time I realized what a giant gap was between poor Soviet collective farm workers and even Amish in America. But let's talk a little bit about Georgy Malenkov and his economical reforms of 1953. Fun fact, when I went to school and studied history back in the Soviet Union, there was not a single word mentioned about Georgy Malenkov. It's pretty much Stalin died, and next leader was Nikita Khrushchev. So there was no mentioning of Georgy Malenkov whatsoever. I mean, now with internet and Wikipedia and other sources, you can learn way more about the guy. But we had no idea about his reforms or his attempts to reform the Soviet economy. So I find it kind of interesting. I also find interesting that attempts to reform Soviet economy and improve situation with food in the Soviet Union started only after the death of Stalin. And when I researched a little bit Malinkov's reforms of 1953, it actually matched perfectly the story of Robert Robinson. A lot of it was reducing taxes on the peasants. They also allowed them to increase their lots 5 times. So that makes me wonder, because my grandparents, their lot was so-called sotka, so it's a 100th of the hectare. So they were allowed to cultivate 40 sotkas. So that will be 0.4 of a hectare. So sounds that prior 1953, it was 5 times smaller. So they had hardly any land to survive on, which of course means if you work at a collective farm, you'll be stealing a lot of food to survive. And it's kind of funny, I read the comment that after peasants were allowed to cultivate 5 times more land, food production increased 50%. I was like, duh, what did you expect? You let people to have more land, they'll grow more food. But Malinkov's reforms were not only about agriculture, he also wanted to start developing so-called легкая индустрия and food industry. Легкая индустрия, so that's can be translated as a light industry, so production of consumer goods instead of heavy industry where you make steel and dig coal and just pretty much making things to make other things or make weapons, which is Comrade Stalin was really good at. They wanted to turn economy towards people and improve life of the Soviet citizens. And if you look at the numbers from 1953 to 1957, agriculture production increase was drastic. So production of grain and vegetables increased 40%, sugar beets 68%, meat 41%, milk 36%, eggs 56%. So that was unheard of for Soviet Russia jump in agriculture production. All it took is just let people work for themselves and make money and not to work for free at a collective farm. I mean, really? Malinkov even managed to cut down 50% expenses on military. So army wasn't happy, but he got agreement from Beria and Bulganian to reduce expenses on the military. And he also stopped several large projects, for example, like continuing building a railroad in Siberia, which later was started again in the 70s, so-called BAM, Baikalo-Amurskaya Magistral. That project was stopped, and the funds were transferred into developing consumer production and food production. And this article that I'm getting this information is actually from the Russian website, which is quite pro-Stalin and anti-American, because they say that they needed to be really careful about reducing expenses on the military-industrial complex in the Soviet Union due to the American plans of nuclear attack. So Soviet Union had to be very careful reducing its expenses on military because America was planning планов ядерного нападения США, so plans of nuclear attack of United States of America. So if anyone has those plans, I would like to see them. And I think I'll need to make a separate video about Grigory Malenkov, research the topic more into detail, because it looks like he was a quite interesting character, and I'm not sure why he lost the power struggle against Nikita Khrushchev. Obviously, we had 3 players, Malenkov, Beria, and Khrushchev, and somehow, first of all, of course, Beria lost big time, and then Malenkov was just removed. So I'm not sure what was going on. It'd be a good thing to research. But it's interesting that he actually did a lot trying to change the whole economical development of Soviet Union back in the 50s. And it looks like Khrushchev continued some of his reforms, but he stopped the other ones. But of course, talking about Grigory Malenkov or even Nikita Khrushchev, we need to remember that dictators like Iosif Stalin, they tend to surround themselves with butt kissers, not real leaders, because dictators hate competition. Okay, my friends, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, please don't forget to like it and share with your friends. And we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. How's the life in the village?
It's pretty nice.
Be careful, put in a bucket, don't dump it.
Green potato.
That's fine. Now you gotta just go through the dirt. Find more. How many you got now?
4 or 5.
Oh, there's more. Whoa! Show me this. Nice, that's a big one. Think it's all?
Here, as you can see, is a pretty average sized beet. You know, just a lot of nuclear radiation makes them huge.
It is humongous, isn't it? It's like the biggest of all of them I found.
Yep.
So that's number 4. Just put it right there behind you. So now we're looking for beets.